Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's There's a Will. Thank you for joining us. We come to you today from the Paris of the East, beautiful downtown Warsaw in the Republic of Poland. And joining me today will be Phil Goss, businessman, business executive, and farmer.
Among other things.
Farmer, and also prospective congressman from the 3rd District of Indiana.
Correct.
Yeah, where your family has long been resident. And we have on the horn from beautiful downtown Bydgoszcz with a picture of a dog behind his head, the effervescent and intellectually acute and empirically experience. It's the same thing, isn't it? Empirically experienced. Tautology. I went too far. I'm no Russell Brand, thank God. Although he seems like a decent guy.
Anthony is his name.
Unless you're a woman.
Anthony
Mcfarlane Gonzalez. Now that may be the longest introduction ever for you, Anthony.
Certainly the slowest.
Absolutely the slowest, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And most painful.
Mm-hmm. Very painful. Hey, watch it now. This gets serious. Not too serious yet.
What shall we talk about today, William?
Well, first thing I wanted to say this, what is all this, we talked about this the last time, one of the shows, I don't know if it was the last time, but about the Paris of the East. Warsaw is being dubbed the Paris of the East.
Again?
Yeah, and a lot of, we know that. I once called Warsaw a city with a face that only a mother could love, which was a very popular line, oft-quoted at the time, even by one of the main architects redoing a lot of public buildings in Warsaw, Swedish fellow. Came up to me in a bar and says, I read your article. You're that guy, aren't you? I said, well, it all depends on what you mean. The guy who wrote about Warsaw, I said, yeah.
Was it the U.S. comic, was it P.J. O'Rourke, who came here in the 80s and then came out and he wrote an essay, a comedic essay about his time in Poland in the 80s, early 80s.
No, late 80s.
Late 80s, was it?
But you're right. It's collected in Holidays in Helm. The essay is called, What Do They Do for Fun in Warsaw? And if you're ever going to write about Warsaw, you need to read that because it's hilarious.
Yeah.
And
I remember the line,
is a
commies love concrete.
Yeah, commies love concrete. It's like the first line, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Unbelievable. And it was like that.
It still is in some places.
Well, but Warsaw is amazing. You come in from out of town, whatever angle you attack the city from, and you see all these new, vast apartment neighborhoods,
modern ones.
Yes. Whatever side of Warsaw you come in from. There are a lot of suburban houses too, but particularly these vast apartment, and you think, where did all these people come from that are living? So there must be a lot of people from Poland and other countries living here that aren't registered in Warsaw, because there is no way Warsaw's population is only 2 million. It's got to be close to double that in the metropolitan area.
Remember, in Poland, oftentimes people's declared address will affect their taxes, it will affect their car registration and insurance prices, and so oftentimes they'll keep their registration for voting and other legal matters and banking back at the homestead, wherever that happens to be, and then simply own a house and live in Warsaw, but still maintain their car registration back home where Mom and Dad might be or wherever, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that was pointed out to me by a friend of mine, a Polish friend of mine, who said, well, these people have got to live somewhere. And I think those people that are coming in and living in the old flats that were here, and the people are selling those old flats to those people, or renting them, and moving into the other places. Because back in the 90s, everybody was pretty much gifted the property that they were living in. So people have inherited their parents' flat, or not yet, but from the 90s, say. They inherited their parents' flat by now, grandmother's flat, people were inheriting. And so you created this class of wealthy apartment or house owners, property owners, correspondingly wealthy across the broad section of the populace, which was very smart, I think.
If we compare the demographics of people living in these older housing units 30 years ago plus to today, what we've seen is a ghettoification of these older blocks because it's a less desirable situation, unless, of course, it has a particularly attractive location within the city. Whereas we see a gentrification of what was perhaps formerly industrial or agricultural land with these new buildings that you see. People who can afford to move from the old buildings to the new buildings will do so, possibly maintaining the ownership of the old apartment and renting it out to students, immigrants, temporary people in for a contract, what have you. So those older buildings are becoming less and less communities of people long-term, living there long-term, and more either rental properties or perhaps those who are on the economic fringes. Transient or economic fringes, perhaps those with fewer opportunities in life. Or perhaps those who are simply here for a short time.
Or people who don't want to get into the long-term mortgage.
But of course, those with means will rent a place in a nicer building. So it's just because a person's here temporarily doesn't mean they're...
Well, it depends on what people want to do with their disposable income, really.
Yes.
So, but what you're saying is really a valid point, and I think the most important point, isn't it, that there's more choice through the market, and people have been enriched through that. Which
didn't exist. If we go back
ownership.
to the early 90s, I was working for a short time with the National Home Builders Association here in Poland to develop the Polish Association of Home Builders. And what we saw was a very monolithic structure for residential construction inherited from the 80s and earlier. But what we were trying to support was adoption of American technologies in building for residential structures, and this was everything from tar paper shingles to frame constructed housings and so forth. And what we were trying to help develop was the sector that would expand single-family dwellings in a manner that was creating an energy-efficient dwelling. The older dwelling construction methods here, which were very heavy brick, were designed to be bulletproof because they were kind of waiting on the Russians to come. Maybe that wasn't a bad idea. Let's hope it's not necessary. But the idea that the light American construction they looked upon as very unstable. But the point is...
Hence these big cement walls and
right,
stuff
but the point with the American idea is it's economically efficient because it happens quickly and cheaply, and it reduces energy consumption over the lifetime of the house because it's more insulatable.
The houses in America are?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think the houses in America... This is something people say. Maybe Anthony has heard this too. That houses in America are flimsy compared to the ones in Poland.
Yeah, I've actually heard that. And my comparison with my wife, she's definitely... And it's even comparable to some of the houses in the UK. But it just really depends on the location that you have that, because in the Midwest, it really also depends on the location they also do it in, too. But to Phil's point, yes, they have to have a heavy insulation, and the wood is a heck of an insulator, especially with the type of insulation you'll put in. But as you go further south, they start building more homes with more concrete, but not as much. Most of the times you just kind of see stucco, and that kind of defeats the purpose down in the south because it's not really good for that kind of environment. But if you go further north, that makes sense.
Yeah,
So,
but I think the interesting thing in Poland, because I've often had the same thought. As I look at these Polish houses, they look like fortresses, some of them, don't they?
Yeah, that's what everybody says when they see the pictures that we show them, the homes that we have.
Yeah.
Whereas I think it's not appropriate to compare the United States as one entity and housing there versus housing in any other place, because really each state has its own building code, and those building codes vary greatly from one to the next. Electrical code is for the most part unified in the United States. It is a national electric code. But the building codes for the states and even in the counties within any given state may vary from one to the next. And from what I understood historically, Georgia had one of the strongest building codes, and Texas had one of the weakest.
I didn't know that. But I just thought it was interesting to point out how much Warsaw has grown, because people may not be aware of that. The fact that Warsaw is becoming seen more and more as one of the most vibrant, can I say that? Vibrant cities in Europe, and and a cultural center, which is why they're calling it, I suppose, the Paris of the East. Although I always think that calling it the Paris of the East is a little insulting to both Paris and Warsaw, because there's only one Paris, and it's incomparable, and there's only one Warsaw, and in its way, it's unique.
The old joke was that a man from Moscow and a man from Paris were taking trains to the other city. They both arrived at Warsaw, looked out the window, and thought they had arrived.
Yeah, and I think that still holds true today. Do you think that holds true today, Anthony?
Yeah, it's actually very true there.
Yeah.
When I first arrived at Warsaw, it was I was like, wow, this is beautiful. And comparing when I'd landed in Paris and I was actually walking around, Warsaw is just stunning, like 10 times more cleaner and much more vibrant. And people are walking around a lot more.
Then where?
Granted, there's a lot. Well, than Paris.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Paris is very smelly.
Yes. And
I always
contrary
remember.
to popular belief that people think it's not, but it's extremely smelly.
Paris has its own very individual smell mixed with, sewers and river and cigarettes and wine and garlic. It has all that mixed together.
And dog guano.
And dog guano. I don't know about that, but certainly it has a unique smell. But I once wrote an article. See, I'm a bit, kind of naughty, I suppose. But I once wrote an article about Paris that got kind of widely sold, and the first line was, "Paris stinks. You must not say so." Hear that, the first two lines. Or in your case, maybe a semicolon.
Yes.
Yeah.
No.
Phil's a punctuation advocate. So anything on Twitter drives him mad. Anthony, what about in Bydgoszcz? Does the stuff we're saying about Warsaw, does that apply in some way to Bydgoszcz? Bydgoszcz is next to Torun, by the way. Torun, beautiful Gothic city. Bydgoszcz, smaller city, or bigger city maybe.
Bigger.
It's bigger,
it's a
isn't
bigger
it?
City. Mm-hmm.
But not Gothic. I mean, it's
Bydgoszcz
different.
is the 6th largest city in Poland, I believe.
Is it?
Yes, sir. 830,000 plus, not including some of the outskirts that belong to Bydgoszcz.
Well, I like Bydgoszcz. I think it has a lot to recommend it. It's certainly worth a couple of days hanging around and checking things out and nearby, but also particularly during the Camera Image Film Festival, which is the world film festival for cameramen. It is the top festival for cameramen and DPs, directors of photography, in the world. And they all go there. And gosh, those people can tell a story. They know everything about not only filmmaking, but all the gossip from the sets. They're great, these guys. That's the book to write. Interviews with those guys.
Some actors actually show up. One of the most prolific actors that shows up around here quite consistently is Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, he loves it in Poland, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir, he does.
And I hear he's a really horrible guy.
Oh, dude, absolutely horrible.
Everybody says he's the nicest guy you'll ever meet.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Yeah. And why not? And why not? Good actor, too. Now, just to move on, I wanted to just start with some stuff about Poland, some Poland-centric stuff before we move on. And because since the war started, we've been addressing Ukraine almost every program. There was a UFO program, and there's been a couple of other programs, but almost everything has had to do every week with some aspect of what's going on in Ukraine and the war with Russia, and everything surrounding that, threats to Poland, the United States and Western Europe's role in this, the Russia, the Chinese access, if it exists or not, and to what extent, and so forth, energy problems, all of these things we've discussed. But now, suddenly, Philip and Anthony, in the last 2 weeks, 10 days, since Israel was attacked by Hamas, insurgents and terrorists, things have changed. That boiling, simmering pot, which is always in the Middle East, is boiled over. And That's a great metaphor, isn't it? Yeah. Sorry.
Yes.
The cliche. Yeah. Sorry about that.
As
But
metaphors go, it is cliche.
it was a cliche. Yeah. And but at any rate, we can just say this: it's the S has hit the fan, and that's not a cliche because that's a façon de parler. That's a manner of speaking, and a saying. So the S has hit the fan, and it caught us all by surprise. I don't know why it has, but the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, and then suddenly we see the biggest attack on Israel since, on Jews specifically, since
World War II.
Yeah, since the Holocaust, and also on Arabs to that extent, because there's 7 million Jewish Israelis and 2 million Arab Israelis. So when you attack Israel, you're attacking those Arabs as well, and that is fine with the Iranians who back Hamas and Hezbollah. Why is it fine with the Iranians? Because they hate Arabs. They're Persians. They look down on Arabs, those nasty tribesmen who've been a fly in the ointment for thousands of years to the Persians, who once ruled the whole area for a very long time, before, in the times of ancient Greece. They fought a number of wars, didn't they? This is something that's gone on and on. The antagonism between Iran and the Arabs, the desire for Russia and Iran to establish hegemony over as much Arab territory as they can, hence Syria, Iraq invasions, hence incursions into Lebanon by Hezbollah and Hamas into Palestine, Palestinian West Bank and Gaza Strip. What is the end game? Let's talk not about specific events, but the long-term outlook for, in the rest of the time we have, long-term outlook for the Middle East based on this particular new war, because it's been declared as a war by Israel against Hamas, which must mean, at least in the background, also against Iran and Hezbollah, and perhaps even Russia. And how does that affect the war with Ukraine? Because Ukraine has suddenly dropped out of the news. Try and find a story about Ukraine in the last 10 days.
You can't.
It's gone. And it was already fading because of things we talked about, war fatigue, etc. First, let's look at how the recent news, war, invasion, murder, rape, etc., in Israel and Palestine, Palestinian areas, has changed things with regard, geopolitically, with regard to Ukraine and, say, the relationship between the big three, United States, China. And I'm going to let you think about it, Phil. I want to go to Anthony, our security expert. Anthony, cybersecurity expert and ex-Special Forces. He's an advisor also to the Polish and American governments on many issues. Okay, Tony, what do you think?
All right, so both Israeli intelligence and the U.S. intelligence did an absolute snafu. For most people that don't know what snafu is, please look it up. I'm not going to use those choice words on the live broadcast, but it was a snafu on both parts because they blatantly ignored it. They had warnings coming in, so now they're trying to recover from it, and they're still trying to push forward. The implications that we have on the ground there from the Arab countries that are there, what we were talking about, we talked about this off air, what the Arab countries are doing and how are they supporting Palestine. Well, not all of them really want to support Palestine, and it's not really something of a vested interest for the Palestinian government, which most of the Palestinian government is under control by Hamas. However, interesting thing that people don't know is that there is a lot of aid being funded by the United States to Palestine still going on right now. Now, how is that going to be affected in the future? Well, if the U.S. completely cuts off that aid, that leaves Palestine dependent on all the Arab countries in that area that supposedly back them. So that's going to be money out of their pockets. That's a vested interest for them not to lose that funding and aid to fund Palestine if the U.S. pulls out. That's also not including the funding that they're getting from the EU and other nations that are giving them funding for humanitarian aid, for government stabilization, for infrastructure rebuilding, things of that nature. As far as the players of the Arab countries, yes, that's going to affect them because that's money out of their pocket, and that's not going to be able to help feed their needs that they have. I see that the major funding players that have to be put into that would be Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and of course the infamous pain in the butts that we've always had in the Middle East, Iran. But they have already been involved in their training the Hamas militants and Hezbollah militants in Lebanon. Now, the reason why I'm saying Lebanon in this particular instance is because they have had a little bit of skirmishes up in the north, and Lebanon is also getting close to being a failed state. Now, if you guys remember that Lebanon has been suffering economically for the past 6 to 7 years, and their monetary value, well, their own monetary currency has inflated. I don't know, this may be an exaggeration, but maybe 200 or 300%, kind of like how you've seen Venezuela's currency going up and spiking like crazy. And banks, and actually there's been a couple of riots and people have threatened to kill people in banks, holding them hostage because the banks don't want to release their money. And we're not talking just only the Lebanese currency, we're talking actual Euro, USD, that are stuck in the banks. So that's just an economic background on Lebanon and why these militant groups like to be involved in states that are almost failed or in the brink of failing.
Phil, thank you, Anthony. I don't have any follow-up on that. Would you care to add what the? We don't have much time left in this segment. Would you care to comment on what Tony was saying?
Well, I think I could easily echo most of, not all of what Tony's just said.
I think he's framing things well.
Yeah, I might suggest that Lebanon has long been a failed state, not that it's becoming a failed state. It's just been a failed state through different guises of failed statehood. And we've seen that over the last 40 years, really. Mm-hmm. If we look at just a few years ago, the explosion that happened there in Beirut, where one of the biggest explosions ever recorded on Earth from these chemicals, right? Not nuclear explosion, obviously. But and that's a result of a failed state, of a failed system of monitoring and safety.
Yeah.
And
what is this explosion you're talking about?
Was it not? Where was it? Was that in Beirut? It was in Beirut.
No, it was Beirut. It was the second biggest explosion outside of a thermonuclear explosion.
It was a chemical factory or something. What was it?
It was it was chemical warehouse that was right on the port.
That's right. Okay.
And it decimated that entire port. Right now, there's a crater that they are still trying to figure out what were the failed safety systems. Of course, it was because the government didn't want to actually secure it in a secure facility. So the environment took place.
They didn't want to admit what was there. Yeah.
Yeah. And they had pre-warnings. Literally, they had warnings from the docks. They had warnings from the investigators that were actually doing the work properly. And the government just ignored them blatantly, to Phil's case on that.
Yeah. So I think anything that Iran supports in the Middle East is only designed to benefit Iran and hurt their enemies. And so that code of the desert...
Again, remembering that Iran is closer to Russia than they are to Arab countries. They don't like Arab countries. They hate Iraq. Right. They fought throughout the,
But the old
20th century.
Three-way competition was Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Iraq is essentially off the map now, and for the moment can't be anything other than neutral. But Iran is supporting destabilization in the Arab world by ostensibly supporting their Islamic brothers. However, I think their interest is solely strategic in sowing chaos that they may destabilize the Arab world, distinct Arab world from the Muslim world. Muslim world has many different factions, be it Persian, Arab, Turkish, Indonesian.
Yeah, Muslim but not Arab. That's
correct.
So they're divided because they're a common religion, because they're also Shiite in Iran, and most of the Arabs are Sunni.
Correct. But are Hamas, are they not also Shiites?
Hamas is Shiites.
Yeah, and therein lies that unification between themselves and Iran.
And Hezbollah too.
Yeah.
So they're surrounded. They're the Sunnis surrounded by. But what are the Palestinians?
Well, the Palestinians, Hamas being from Palestine, I think they're all, or mostly, are they not all Shiite?
Yeah. Where do the Palestinians come from? We
Arab
got to
world.
go now. That's a question. We're going to come back with the answer to that. I just had in my ear, we got to go to the break. We'll come back and talk about where the heck do the Palestinians come from and how long has this been going on? Enjoy the commercials, and as usual, I know you're going to do this because you listen to me as you should. Buy everything you see in these advertisements. Go out immediately after the show. I don't care. Go to the 24-hour market. Purchase, purchase, and purchase because it keeps us on the air. See you. Yep, there we are. We're back with Phil Goss. He's told me not to call him Philip. That's what his mother calls him. He's known as Phil Goss for Congress, if you look him up on, what is it, Facebook, and also...
We have all social media, yes,
Yeah.
and a website of the same
and a
name.
website, Phil Goss for Congress, okay? And we have Tony Mcfarlane Gonzalez. There he is, in Bydgoszcz. We can't see the dog poster that of your wife's too well today, but never mind. We know it's there. We know it's there. And
You see it
that's
in
all that
spirit.
matters. That's all that matters. Okay, so we're coming back. We left, and the question was, who are the Palestinians? Because I hear a lot of talk all over about this thing, all over the internet about this conflict and the recent events. And no one's really talking about who the Palestinians are. So who are they? Anthony. And then Philip will fill in.
So
Phil, not Philip.
no, so Palestinians are from Jordan. Everybody has to understand that they are a Jordanian tribe that it was considered an Arab Bedouin tribe. They moved to Palestine because that's where they have had religious backgrounds that date back to the 10th century, if not even earlier than the 10th century BC. And we're talking 625 BC to roughly right around where Israel started getting convoluted. And I'll let Phil explain that, but they're a Bedouin tribe that has claimed land in Israel that is, they say it's rightfully theirs as a holy land.
So
On top of that,
let's look at that claim right now and then go further into that, because I think it's important to understand the nature of that claim. Jews claim the Holy Land as their gift from God. Palestinians make that same claim, and why is there a conflict dating back 2,700 years or more to what is the promised land? What was the promise? To whom was it made? And who is the heir to that promise? So if we go back into the Old Testament, God promised to Abraham, or was it to Abraham and Sarah, an important distinction here, the land which we know as Palestine or Israel. This is the promised land. Sarah was having trouble begetting a son or a child of any kind. And so Abraham, being a man of the times, went off with Jezebel, a name we have come to know in a different light, perhaps in the pejorative.
I know it from the film starring Bette Davis.
Yes, and so Abraham and Jezebel had a son named Ishmael. And Ishmael is the paternal genitor of the Palestinians. Later then, Sarah is encumbered with child, gifted with a child, and that is David.
Jezebel is basically a home wrecker. That's the idea, yeah?
Or perhaps a surrogate mother.
No, that's not right.
Anthony
says it's not right.
It's a significant question.
Yeah.
And the answer to that depends on which side of that fence you sit on.
There you go.
Because the Palestinians say, no, that was a promise to Abraham and his first child, not to Abraham and Sarah to their first child.
Wow, okay.
And so Abraham and Sarah have David, who is the
King David.
uniter of the 8 Israeli tribes, Jewish tribes. which comprise the nation of Israel. And so the question is then, from whom is the inheritance received? And Judaism, Israelis have a maternal system fundamentally from this origin, whereas others have a paternal, because they're saying, oh no, it was to Abraham only, solely to him, and not to Abraham and Sarah together. So that's the question. And it goes back 2,700 years, and which of the two half-siblings is the rightful heir? And rather than saying, well, why don't we just share it together, they're still fighting today.
Yes. And the problem with the history that they have is that it's just been bloodied all the way up and down, from the Byzantine times to, well, of course, Roman times, Byzantine times, Mesopotamian times, all the way up until the UN tried to step in. Now, I know I'm skipping thousands of years of history here, and of course, bloodshed back and forth with Christianity really driving, forgive the pun on this or the terminology, but driving a knife down their throat.
So that was 1,000 years ago. That was the Crusades. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But that started with the
900
Romans,
years
the Roman Crusade.
Yeah.
But then you're talking about the Knights Templar with the Vatican pushing that down to Jerusalem. And that's where they wanted to conquer Jerusalem, because the Christians think that, of course, that it is the Holy Land. It is a Holy Land, but it's for everybody. But there's three major religions that consider that land holy: Christianity, Judea, and Islam. So, but the problem that we have is that after the World Wars, they started to get more people to go down to Jews didn't have a home after World War I. They didn't have a home. So that's where you found a lot of Jews living in Europe. You have a lot of Jews living in the United States, Jews living in South America and in Africa, believe it or not in Egypt. A lot of them didn't live in Egypt. There's a reason for that. There's a bad history and bad blood. Now, come the Holocaust, the World War II. This is the bloodiest event before the Hamas incident 13 days ago, the now Hamas war. After the World War, the United Nations, in their infinite wisdom, decided to create a partition plan.
Wait, now this was World War I, and it was League of Nations, and we're talking about Balfour. Is this correct?
No.
You're talking about after World War II.
After World War II, because there's a reason why I'm saying I'm skipping World War I for a minute, because World War II, the Arab League of Nations ignores the Balfour Agreement that the British had in agreement with Palestine and Israel.
After World War I, 1919.
Exactly.
This is why T.E. Lawrence was so upset, because he had promised the Arabs they would have their land, and it wasn't honored eventually by the British. They would have rule over their land. That was it. Okay,
they
go ahead.
They would have rule over their Palestinian, their holy land, which is Palestine. Then now to this day, they're still fighting that. But the UN, along with the Arab League of Nations, denied and ignored the Balfour Act and basically nullified it. And since then, they have made modifications to it, and the Israelis they just didn't acknowledge it. Of course, why would you? It's your land. You're not going to give it up. No one would give up their land. And so that's where they've been having that fight since. And Palestinians, they were promised this by the Brits and the Arab League of Nations.
Israel didn't just get this land. They fought.
Literally acquired it.
They fought very hard, and also did some very used some IRA type.
They had to fight
tactics.
The British to get on shore. They had beach landings, and the British were defending the shoreline against these cargo ships full of civilians coming in from Europe.
You may remember the biggest bombing incident in the UK was the Harrods bombing, and the biggest bombing incident when the Israeli Jews were trying to establish control over that part of the world, that sliver of the Middle East, was the King David bombing by the Irgun, which was the underground movement, similar to the IRA. I mean, and it was an underground movement, although quite different in many ways.
But remember, guys, this after the UN partition plan, this sparked the Arab-Israeli War. And once the Arab-Israeli War hit,
Of 1948.
Yes, and
Yeah.
that included members from the Arab League of Nations that are Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, which was a failed state because of who we ousted, and Syria also is considered still a failed state by some or the vast majority of the Western nations, but not considered a failed state by Russia, Iran, or China, or any of the BRIC countries. Now, and I say that interestingly enough because I will touch on the BRIC countries a little bit later, especially one in particular, which has very close ties to the UK, which is South Africa. And a lot of people would be surprised as to what South Africa has been doing. And we've touched on that months ago, but I'm pretty sure people have forgotten.
Tell us.
So South Africa has been providing arms and ammunition and not only weaponry, but equipment to Russia to filter and help the fight in Ukraine. And they have not blatantly denied it. They just have kept it really quiet, and the media has not even covered anything of that nature, but they have. BRICS countries are in line with China, Iran, and Russia, along with a couple others that are Indonesia. And India is not part of the BRICS country. That's Indonesia, not India. India does not have any part in that. So, yes, it is one of the reasons why the British, I don't know if the British cut out of there, but they still have been supported by, yes, Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela openly, in multiple forums, says that he has had help from and will support Palestine. South Africa has supported Palestine since their inception. They do not divulge or do not condone any of the actions that they do, but they will supply them with weapons and munitions to support their fight. And that's why they've done it since the beginning, since Nelson Mandela days.
Why?
Now. Because apartheid. They were supported by Russia during the apartheid when everybody
So they're
else
calling the Palestinian situation apartheid. So, I mean, a lot of people are doing that.
Yes.
Does that seem right to you?
No. The way that they're going about it by murdering people like that, and it's, to me.
How is it apartheid? I mean, if all they have to do is stop fighting and assimilate the way the other Arabs have into Israel, where there are 2 million Arab citizens in Israel. So
it's Hamas.
They're even in the government.
It's not the Palestinians. It's
right.
Hamas.
Mm-hmm. That's
Hamas
the point.
Is the issue that has.
So why is South
70%
Africa helping Hamas?
Money.
Who's supporting it? Hamas has nothing. Palestine has nothing. Or the Gaza Strip,
supporting
let's
them?
say.
Iran, Russia, and all the BRIC countries that are there.
Where is South Africa getting support? You mean from China and Russia and Iran, or what's the point there?
They're getting the whole point is that the BRICS countries have been supporting movements like this from Palestine since the very beginning, and people don't talk about it, and they need to know, because there are countries that they consider allies that they're not allies. They're actually just two-faced individuals that will constantly tell you yes, yes, yes to your face, and then completely do a 180 in the background and backstab you in the back.
I'm going to suggest something further than that. I'm going to suggest it's because of broadly Marxist and systemic Marxist beliefs in those countries. And the left wing has always been against, the left totalitarianists have always been against Israel because
But South Africa was not a totalitarianism.
What?
South Africa hasn't been a totalitarianism. It's been
they're left.
Spokenly.
They're left, and they're allied
Yes.
with those kind of with China and Russia, and they're the leftists basically. Well, China is,
China definitely. But
this is a veneer of capitalism in both countries, but they're dictatorships built on Marxist.
But with South Africa, how much of it is ideological and how much of it
dogma.
is simply profit-taking?
Sorry, what?
How much of it for South Africa is ideological and how much of it is simply profit-taking?
yeah, exactly, and that's the whole point that I'm getting at, is that I think most of the vast majority of it is profit-taking, so that way they can keep their economy up because they are extremely close to collapsing.
South Africa is.
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of the BRICS countries are close to collapsing. It's also, this is part of the war against the United States and Western Europe and the Five Eyes countries, which we know what those are, Australia and New Zealand and Canada, along with Britain and the United States. This is anti the West. This is a power bloc of the BRICS countries, which they're called now, against those people who back Israel. So it's a way of undermining the position of the United States in the Middle East. It's also a way of backing the Shiites against the Sunnis, who also are held together by the United States, which keeps stability in that area. Is that not right? I mean, argue with me if you don't agree.
I wonder what the end game is, though, because let's just game theory this out into the future.
That's what I wanted to do, yeah.
And so let's just say, what happens if they're successful? They sow discontent and discord, and okay, great. So Hamas attacks Israel, and what's considered a victory? Or is there even one defined? Russia invades Ukraine. What do they consider a victory? A total collapse of Ukraine. We can understand what the game theory is from that side. Didn't work out that way, but what's the game theory with Hamas? I think at the end of the day, they are pawns acting at the behest of Iran for a larger, on the
What's
larger
the larger
chessboard.
game, yes. And how does that affect Ukraine? And was Iran behind this in order with the Russians, etc., to destabilize Ukraine or take the heat off Ukraine?
I think the larger question is
Tony's
one
got
of
something to say, too.
geopolitics,
Yeah.
and here's where I think the miscalculation is on the part of Russia and Iran.
Hold that thought, Tony.
We see them as large petroleum exporters. What they fail to see is that the shale revolution in the United States means that we have the cleanest and cheapest source of fossil fuel in light sweet, that's a residual product from processing shale. And so the math has changed in the last 4 or 5 years. They weren't counting on that, and they didn't bother looking at how technology has progressed and means that they no longer have a chokehold on food, fuel, or anything else. So if they think they're going to have the world begging at their feet for their oil and their grain, think again. Because now the U.S. produces all of our component fertilizer as another intermediate product from processing shale. So what we see is a total decoupling from Russian fertilizer, a total decoupling and disinvestment as we're seeing with China. We've not needed Iranian fuel for a long time. We're an exporter ourselves from the United States. So their failure to see how the math has changed since the 70s or 80s means they're fighting a war which no longer has an end game.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Tony.
To touch on Phil's, if you guys remember, there was an interesting move that Russia did along with China, but mainly Russia, that they went to the OPEC dealers, the OPEC countries, and they were talking about trying to get rid of the US dollar as being the main currency from there. They're trying to destabilize the world as we have it, as the Western world has created it already, to be in their favor. Now, this may be a crazy thing that people are going to probably chastise me, but bring it on. The Ukrainian war is not just it is a land grab, but it's not just a war that is just to cause a war because he wants Ukraine. It has a purpose. He wants to control Ukraine because why? What is Ukraine? It's a large country that produces what? How much percent of the world's grains? 35% of the world's grains.
A lot, yeah.
And
it's the fourth largest grain producer or grain exporter in the world.
That's after Russia, Canada, U.S. Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Now, that grain goes to how many countries in Africa?
Quite a few.
We're talking quite a few. Exactly. Then there also, the people don't talk about are that they have agrochemical chemicals that come out of Ukraine. That's one. Now, they didn't get it. They didn't win it. So what has Russia been doing? They've been destroying those lands as they have been losing the war. By how? Mining them, making it infertile for farmers and deadly for them to actually do that. 2, if they saw the move that, oh my gosh, we're losing this war, all right, fine, we're going to go on another economic route to try and destabilize the rest of the world and fail the USD and the euro and bring it down. Because those two currencies are intrinsically entwined along with the British pound, but that's one of the oldest currencies in the world. But that's what they tried to do with OPEC. They tried to bind us. And as Phil pointed out, that the United States is an exporter. They don't rely on Iranian oil. They don't rely on Arab oil as much as people think they do because of what? Thank goodness technology has advanced. That's why there's been a lot of moves to actually find a replacement fuel so that way we do not become solely dependent on these countries that can actually just pull the plug. That's the other thing. Then they're trying to make their own currency. They've actually announced that with the BRICS countries. That's why we've been harping on the BRICS countries, because they're not just making moves for providing each other weapons and munitions. They're trying to provide their own world currency to try and destabilize what the USD and other currencies have established throughout the rest of the world, and bringing world trade and commerce to a halt from the West to bring it back to the East control.
Bill?
I might suggest this also. There was another reason that Russia wanted Ukraine, and especially Crimean Peninsula, is that the mineral reserves within the Sea of Azov, and they wanted to have unfettered access to that. Well, that soon won't be a case anymore. But also when we look at Africa on the background of the idea of destroying or at least controlling the food supply to Africa through Ukraine, we can see that the economic trends are such, with China's cost of labor going up and their ability to meet the demands for labor going down, that Africa may well be the next China, let's call it. And they may be trying to avert that by upstream trying to reduce the African consumer countries into servitude by holding and controlling that food supply from Ukraine.
That's an interesting point, and it makes sense as a strategy. How do you see what's going on right now in Israel and Gaza affecting Ukraine?
It affects Ukraine greatly because it takes the world's eyes off it and funding to it. Because if you've seen already, the United States has dedicated 2 carrier groups, with a third possibly being ramped up and developed already. And it's taken troops out of quote unquote training exercises to prepare them for a potential invasion or defense, as they're calling it, defense of their allies. But it's not an invasion, sorry, that's the wrong word, but in defense of their ally. But they're strategically placing them in the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Eastern Mediterranean.
3 carrier groups, that's over 150 ships.
Yes, and that's a massive force. And this is what they're calling as a deterrent. However, they are not just a deterrent. They are actually stopping missiles from being launched. As you guys have probably heard over on Saturday, that the USS Carney actually dropped 3 cruise missiles from Yemen. So there's a lot of countries already in play that are already acting on this, and the news media are playing it really coy as to what they're putting out. But a lot of countries are already involved in this, but we don't, as governments, call it as a world war.
Is it a strategy? Thanks, Tony. Is it a strategy to knock by the Russians and some maybe with the Chinese, Iranians, somehow to knock Ukraine, to get the attention from Ukraine?
Yes, because that's going to leave the funding that is needed for the weapons to keep the fight going and actually break through some of the defense barriers that Russia set up that are failing, literally. But then at the same time, that's going to show that the West is like, hey, they are losing the battle because they don't have any funds, and that's a war of attrition. This is what they want. They want attrition.
Jump in, Phil. Phil. We got 2 minutes. War of attrition. Okay, we got 2 minutes left.
2 things interesting, I think, that have happened in the past few days. Number one, the U.S. State Department came out and put a global warning, worldwide warning to all American citizens anywhere in the world. Exercise extra caution. Well, let's read between the lines on that. Something big is going to happen soon, and you need to be ready, or maybe you need to come home.
Yeah, what do you think that's all about? I mean, that's been around for a while.
The last time they haven't, but the thing that is
have they ever done that before, in your knowledge?
Yes, they have. That was right after 9/11.
After 9/11, okay.
The second thing is this, and I think we saw this yesterday or 2 days ago. Mitch McConnell came out and said, yeah, I think we should tie Ukrainian aid and Israeli aid together now. And so what we are seeing is, even within Mitch McConnell and his caucus within the United States Congress, an understanding that we had better get all of our ducks in a row, let's just call it, because we do have something big happening, and all the destabilization that we've seen the past couple of weeks in Congress must be overcome. And what we're looking at is a proposal now to create a bipartisan coalition to create the next speaker.
It's interesting. That's very interesting. And also the president came out and finally said what we've been saying on the show. It is America, the United States, that can lead the world in down the right path and combat the BRICS countries and the various terrorist organizations, and has to have strong leadership to do that. Don't you think, Tony?
Absolutely. And we were not going to find that in the European Unions because when any countries in the European Union, except for Poland, because they actually have listened to the U.S., even them, they have a grain of salt that they have to catch up on and listen to. But a lot of the European countries have really destabilized their own military power and might, with the saddest and most disturbing one being the British. They used to have the global power. They used to be the country.
Yep.
They controlled 50 to 60% of the world.
Well, yeah, we know.
Literally.
Thank you, Tony. We got to go to the last word. Phil, you've got 20 seconds.
I would agree, but for Scandinavia, Sweden now making steps within Turkey to come into NATO, Finland now in NATO, and Sweden's a game changer for that.
Yeah,
and
so
the
so
Scandinavians
Poland,
really are allied
Great
with the
Britain,
U.S.
and the Nordic countries
Yes.
together have created a new alliance, which is absolutely the most vital part of Europe now. Even though Great Britain is no longer in the European Union,
Nor
their
is
financial power.
Norway's not EU either, but NATO is what matters here.
Their financial power is very great. Still, you mentioned the fact of the British Empire, but Britain still has great power through finance and through the use of the language throughout the world, just as the United States and the other Five Eyes countries. The Five Eyes countries share that. Okay, that's all we've got. Thanks, gentlemen. I learned a lot, and that was interesting to me. I'm glad we had the chance to get together and have this talk, because there are a lot of questions that are not answered. We've raised some more questions, but we've also answered a little, I think, a lot of the background for people on this, and I hope people will find it useful. And that means you. Thank you for watching. I want to thank Phil Goss for Congress, for being with us, and as his website is called, and also Tony Mcfarlane Gonzalez, who is ex-Special Forces, cybersecurity expert, and a advisor to both the American and the Polish governments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. That's it.
No, gracias, Anna Maria.
Good show.
Grazie.
How was that, Tony?